Our clinic presenter this evening is one of our own, that is Robin Peel, who is a resident here in the Seattle area. Robin has become a very key part of our narrow gauge community out here. He chaired our recent National Narrow Gauge Convention in Tacoma. And before that, he was our treasurer in 2012 for the convention we did in Bellevue. And because he did such a good job, we actually had money left over. Robin is going to talk tonight about DCC and as an introduction. And so, Robin, please take it
Thank
away.
You, Russ. Thank you, Russ. You should be seeing my screen now. So, yeah, so what, as a group, the group that actually puts together these monthly events, what we decided was it might be a good idea to do a series of presentations on DCC, Digital Command Control, which I'm sure you all know. And the goal here is to try and get people actually enthused about using it. It's not really intended for the experts. It's really about those people who, yeah, I've been using DCC, but I'm scared to do all this fancy programming and get everything running as it should. It's really trying to, through a series of presentations, of which this is the first, try and get people to be more comfortable about diving in and doing more with DCC. So like I try to put here, we're trying to remove a little bit of the mystery about doing this. It isn't maybe as hard as maybe if you're scared, you might think, and explain some of the technology options so we can actually talk together intelligently, or even if we can't do that, maybe at least intelligibly. And I'm going to assume that during all these presentations, we all know what DCC is. I'm not going to go through all of that mundane stuff. And in general, try and keep it elevated above the technology vendor. So we don't really care what DCC system you're using. I listed a bunch of them there. Trying to keep it a bit more general to try and get you focused. This is going to be the first of a series of sessions. We'll probably do them every 2 or 3 months. And this is number 1. This is real introduction. So tonight we're just looking at the basics and getting some feedback about what else you would maybe like us to present or not present. That would be great. Going forward, I think, particularly Jerry and I were looking at ideas. Something might be about demystifying the installation of decoders into your locomotive, if you wish to do that. Another session could be about getting started in using GMRI Decoder Pro for actually configuring or programming your decoders. And another session could be a bit more of maybe almost a panel discussion about solving common technical problems, like how do I connect my laptop to my DCC command station, things like that. Those are some things there. Like I say, this is not meant to solve the most tricky and most complex problems in the world about using DCC. There's lots of people here who know the answers to a lot of that. But instead, try and get people more comfortable with technology, just get out to try it and dabble and see what capabilities you actually have in your system. So that's actually our goal of this series that we're going to try and kick off tonight. Now, part 1 of maybe 5, I don't know how many, part 1 tonight, the basics, is really about why do we want to even get in there and start configuring our decoders, and what are we actually doing when we actually do that? How and where do we actually do that? And what problems might we face, and maybe how to get started. So I want to preface some of that by saying, I am not an expert in this, so forgive me for that, but I am actually in the process of learning a great deal about it. So if you started tinkering with DCC and you've had some issues, I feel your pain, and yeah, I'm trying to figure my way through it and find a better practice approach to actually do it. And why am I qualified for this is maybe you may not believe that I am, but I do have a background in real-world railway operations. It's what I did after college, and long-term planning for the railway industry in Britain for British Rail and London Underground. But then I migrated towards building planning systems to drive long-term investment planning for the railway industry. And guess what? We didn't have systems to do that, so I built them and had them built. So I then migrated to the building enterprise computer software. And right now, well, until I retired last year, my job was to help our corporate customers best leverage the technology that they'd bought. And I think that's why I think this is relevant tonight. We all have, well, not we all, many of us have an expensive DC system, very expensive decoders in our expensive locomotives. And do we use it to the full? And are we not using it to the full just because it's really, really hard to figure that out? Another fundamental here, which I'm going to try and address a little bit, is DCC is kind of complex technology, and it does have a steep learning curve to actually get the best out of it. But it's pretty old Clinton era technology, right? So the first standards were published, I believe, in the Model Railroader magazine by the NMRA in 1993, before Windows 95 was even invented. So it's quite a while ago. Before then, there were lots of competing products out there during the 80s. Some of them pretty good, some of them not so good. I actually spent all the time working with the Hornby 01 system, which is actually a pretty good one. It was the first true digital system in about 1984, and I even installed a 01 decoder in one of those MDC H13 C21 locomotives, and it worked. A bit of a squeeze, but it worked, and I think it eventually melted the plastic tender shell, but not it overheated. But it's been around for a while, this technology. So getting back to the real basics here, why do you want to configure your decoders? Well, you must set an address for your locomotive, right? If you're lucky, you got a factory sound fitted DCC fitted locomotive, and the address has been set for you. Otherwise, you get a brand new decoder. It'd be set to number 303. So you've got to get in there at least change that. So there has to be some configuration going on. But of course, why would you want to go beyond that? Well, configuring a sound and lighting to your preferences. You're picking a particular horn sound, trying to figure out what lighting you actually want to get running on your locomotives, setting up the firebox flicker and stuff. But another actually kind of slightly more complex one, which I'm actually facing right now, I'll walk through this in a moment, is how do we standardize the use of the function keys in your DCC system across your fleet of locomotives to suit your throttles and how you run your railroad. If you have decoders from different manufacturers, different function key settings, different function keys might do different things, and that can be extremely confusing. So standardizing that is one thing we might want to do. And then we got more fancy with it. Yeah, we might want to set speed curve, momentum, consist locomotives together, speed match your locomotives when you double header train, they pull each other apart or tear into each other, and so on. So fundamentally, what we as a group here are trying to help you do is to take advantage of all those great features that DCC offers, but in a way that suits you, your layout, and how you choose to want to do operations. So that's kind of what we're going on here, what we're trying to accomplish here. By the way, I have 20 minutes to do this tonight, so I think it's a bit of a tall order. So, but I am watching the clock. We're trying to make these presentations end on time. So what does configuration or programming a decoder actually mean? And I will say I prefer the word configuration as opposed to programming. Not programming like in the computer language. We're actually just setting how certain things will work. And I think it's kind of important to remember that. But if you go back 20 years or 10 years and look at some of the documentation and books, it goes on about using arcane hexadecimal numbers that go from A through E, and you see all this gobbledygook in some of the older books, which you'll still see on the bookshelves in the hobby shops. And I think, look at the copyright dates in those books, they're really quite old. I think there's better and more elegant ways to actually configure our decoders now using some of the software tools which are available. And when we talk about configuring our decoders, really what are we doing? We're using this dirty four-letter word, a CV, a configuration variable. And there's a ton of these. But what are those? Well, they're just kind of numbered buckets that live within the memory of your tiny little decoder. And each bucket has a number in it. And really configuring the decoder is just changing those numbers to a different set of numbers, and that will change the behavior of that decoder. So if it says, set CV 92 to value 123, do that and it might do something. The interesting thing is these configuration variables, CVs, are numbered, and there are some standards about what each one should do, and manufacturers generally follow those. But there are a bunch of them which are, it's the Wild West. The manufacturers can use them however they wish to do very, very fancy sound configuration, whatever it might be. So the fact that they're different is confusing if you're trying to do it the old-fashioned way manually by going to your throttle and saying, change DD so to this hexadecimal number. That's kind of hard. So some of the software tools we have out there now can simplify that process because they, in general, know how each manufacturer's decoder works, and they know what each of those configuration variables should do, and they can guide you through the process of actually getting it up and running. So that's why I'm a big fan of using some of these software tools to do this. But that comes with a little bit of a price. You actually have to run that software on your laptop usually, and somehow get your laptop connected to your system. So that's part of what we actually have to do. So, how should we do all of this? Yeah, use your computer. That works great. So how do you connect it? Usually with some kind of USB cable. And what are you connecting it to? Well, you can connect it directly to your DCC system if it has a USB input. Many of the older ones do not. We'll talk about that in a bit later. A really easy way to do it is to use a couple of the tools which are out there, and there may be more, but you may have heard of a Sprog. It's a tiny little device. I have one actually in the other room. It's about the size of a box of cigarettes, I guess, if any of you remember what those look like. And it's really a tiny little standalone DCC command station with a USB socket on the end. You just plug it into your computer, and then software that's expected to program it, for example, GMRI Decoder Pro, can work there. And that's really all it does. It's a really simple low-power device just for configuring a single locomotive decoder. It's great to have on the workbench. They're not particularly expensive. I think I picked mine up at a swap meet about a year or so ago for about $90, as I remember. But it's less than the price of a decent sound decoder. So good. Love it or hate it, but ESU is quite prevalent out there, and I actually have a lot of locomotive ESU decoders, and I actually quite like them and what they can do. They are a bit more complex how they work, and they have their own doohickey, the little box shown here. It's called a lock programmer. It's about the same size. It's a tiny little command station. It only works for ESU decoders as far as I know, and it comes with its own software for using it, which is actually quite pleasant to use. So some of the software choices out there are, you've probably all heard of JMRI Decoder Pro. JMRI stands for, by the way, Java Model Railroad Interface. We'll look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. It's free. You can download it and use it. There's some downsides to it. We'll look at that. The ESU Lock Programmer is technically free. You can download it, but you can only really use it if you buy the $150 or so lock programmer. So whether you've got the software is free, you can argue about that one. It's actually quite nice to use. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Spreadsheets are actually very important. So whether you're using a Mac or using numbers on a Mac or Excel on a Mac or on a PC, spreadsheets are great to actually document what you're actually doing. Don't do it anywhere else. Put it in a Word document or write it on a sticky note or something. If you're programming a lot of locomotives, you need somewhere to be organized and keep what you've done to them. And I'll show you how I use those in just a moment. You can use your actual DCC system's throttle as a last resort. There's some simple things that might be fine. Hey, I want to change this locomotive number. You can do that by setting a couple of CVs or using the throttle to actually do that. It's quite easy to do simple things. Much more complex things, it's easy to get tied up in knots. You may not even know what kind of decoders in this locomotive. How do you know that? Well, it's tough to do that with just the throttle, but if you go to GMRI, it can ping the decoder and try and identify what's inside it, and then it will guide you through how you might be able to configure that. There are some different, approaches we can use to configure these decoders, but I'm a believer in using some of these software tools. So in a bit more detail, GMRI's Decoder Pro software, it's a free download, great. It's quite powerful, but it can be intimidating, and I really appreciate the guys building this thing. The documentation isn't great. It tends to be either just not there or very deeply technical. I haven't really found a good guide as to, I'm using this for the first time, how do I go through the basics of putting a loco on a test track and setting up some basic information for it. There are a ton of YouTube videos out there that might help you. I think some better documentation would be a good thing. That's my personal feeling. And of course, GMRI has other modules, and I think we mentioned in the chat at the beginning about using its operations module. I use its Panel Pro for considering LCC, layout command control, and building CTC panels. There's other stuff that GMRI can actually do. I put a couple of screenshots up here. Here's a picture of what GMRI calls, Decoder Pro calls its roster. Some of the locomotives that I've configured in GMRI, there's a bunch of British 00 ones and growing collection of ones I still have to explore GMRI for my narrow gauge operation. But you can put pictures on there. It's kind of nice. You can see here, I pick this bottom on the list. It shows, oh, here's a picture of 361 and so on. And a couple of random screens, like we can define what the different function keys do down here. That's kind of useful because GMRI actually comes with a little software throttle you can control with your mouse to try your locomotive out on a test track. And it actually puts these words that you define here on that little throttle. So I don't have to remember F3 as a short whistle. It will actually show it on the throttle when you bring up that throttle, which is kind of cool. And over here, well, a speed curve you might want to set. So what speed will this locomotive do for different throttle settings? And you can play around with that, configure that, make it straight line, logarithmic, and think with that. Make your locomotive behave how you want. That's just simple examples of the kind of things you can do in GMRI. One reason why GMRI might appear sometimes a bit clunky is because it was developed using a programming environment called Java, which will work on Windows, on a Mac. I think it might even work on an iPad. It will work on Linux. Because it will work across multi-platforms with the same software, it kind of has a bit of a lowest common denominator feel about it. So the screens you see, the forms you fill in, look a little clunky, and that's just the nature of the beast if you want to write something that's going to work on multiple different devices like a Windows PC or a MacBook Pro. I don't really blame them for that. It's just the nature of the beast. But I just want to explain that's why it looks a little weird sometimes. By contrast, there's something a bit different. The ESU lock programmer, I think, has a much more intuitive interface. It is, I think, the only real way, if you wish, you can load new sound files to an ESU decoder, which is a good thing to do. You can maybe have a stock of decoders and then load the sound files or blow the sound files actually onto them. It has really thorough documentation. It's like a German car manual. It goes through real basics and very logical process. I actually kind of like it, but it's only for the ESU decoders. And like I said earlier, the software is free with the $150 lock program. But anyway, that's what it is. I put a couple of screenshots here to say, no, it looks a little bit different, right? Here I'm looking at the decoder. It has kind of good plain English explanations of what you're trying to do. It does actually tell you here, when you do this, what you're really doing is I'm setting CV3 to this value, a configuration variable 3 to this value, and so on. And that's an option you can turn on or off to show you what CV you're touching. But it can be helpful for you to learn your way through what some of these things are actually doing. Just like I showed for GMRI, here's a speed table out of there, and that's a real simple one, right? But the kind of thing that you can actually do. So I have both of these, and I'll show you how I've got them set up in just a moment. But I do have both of these, and I have a lot of locomotives with ESU decoders. I have a few with different decoders too, for which I use GMRI. So I want to tell you a bit about my approach to actually using this, which if you're new to this and like me, you're just trying to figure this out, is how I actually approach leveraging all of this. So the first thing is I do use my laptop as a primary tool to configure them. So I have a couple of rolling roads, test tracks with the rollers on to test it, and a really rather nice SM3 when I got it. An SM3 symposium not too long ago, I believe, and a 00 gauge one for my British outline 4mm scale locomotive. I have a couple of rolling roads. Because I'm always switching around how I'm connecting my two different rolling roads to my ESU or to my Sprog and so on, I just bought a bunch of simple barrel connectors from eBay, little plugs and sockets with leads already soldered on. That way I can plug things in and out really, really fast and make it much easier. I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. I use my Sprog and my programmer connected to my laptop that I'm talking from tonight, my MacBook Pro with USB. And for most of them, I use the GMRI roster I showed you earlier to save all the configurations that were programmed into my decoders. I read them from the decoder, save them in GMRI, and then I document stuff in a spreadsheet. This is just the starting point. I have these are actually British locomotives here. I'm saying, what is their DCC ID and what are the different function keys on them? It's an interesting problem. You can look across here and see, oh, right, F0 turns on the headlights on all of them, but and F1, oh, that does engine start on all of them. But then F2 on some of them plays a brake, on other ones it plays a horn. Well, that's kind of goofy. I'm going to remember which locomotive and what do they all do. That's just how they came out of the box. The process I've got to go through is there a better, more consistent way of programming all of these that anyone who comes in knows that, yeah, F1 is engine start, F2 is the brake, F3 is the horn high, horn low, whatever it might be. So, and a lot of the guys who railroads I do operations on, like Dale Kreutzer, who's coming up in just a moment as our layout owner, he's programmed all locomotives and the throttle to be consistent by control, and that's very important to do. Right now, I'm just discovering what capabilities all my decoders have, and then I'll consolidate them together into a unified set. And then I'll have to program each one of them or configure each one of them to behave the same way. And it's kind of fun. You prioritize which one of these do I care about, which ones do I not, and figure out a consistent way to actually use them. Now, if you want to see quickly what mine looks like, I will very bravely go and say, here's JMRI live to me right now. So here's a list of locomotives. I can click on one, go down and have a look at this K27, which is basically put on a different screen, and I've got cat hair in my mouth. So there we go. And I can go through, yeah, here's a K27, those function labels, basic configuration of it. It's set to number 453. Oh, I picked the K27 down there, the basic speed control and so on. I can go through this, see how it explores. That's what JRMI actually looks like. Let me shut that. And that's running on my MacBook Pro here. The other one I actually have here is the lock programmer running right here, the ESU lock programmer. This only runs in Windows. I'm using a Windows emulator, in my case Parallels, running it on my MacBook Pro. I don't really care about you, Mr. Norton. You can go away. And again, I find this a little bit more intuitive to go through the basic information about the address, the DCC settings, some function mapping, and so on. I think it's quite easy to actually understand what these things mean, what CPU says saving. But that's actually what that looks like for real. So I'm nearly finished here for tonight. That's my approach to how this works. What I wanted to do is to show you how I have this set up. I took these two quick pictures this morning to show you what I've got. Here's my SM3 rolling road, really nice thing I got at a convention not long ago. Here's the Sprog, that cigarette-sized packet of stuff. You can see it's got a USB cable here, just plugged into my MacBook Pro, my PC. And here, coming out of it, are two wires going through these barrel connectors that just go to the pre-built connectors that go to my rolling road. It's pretty straightforward. And this has another black wire coming off the top here, which is going to a little wall-wart power supply. Here, by contrast, is how my ESU lock programmer works. It's a little bit bigger. It actually has one of these old-fashioned serial ports on it. As in, those again are a relic of the 90s. But it comes out of the box with a free cable, if you buy the $150 lock programmer, free cable that connects it through to a USB socket on my Mac here. Everything else is just the same. I have that same output. It goes through another barrel connector, which I missed from that shot, connect to my rolling road. And by using these little connectors, I can switch them out really quickly and use different ones on here. And eventually, I'm going to mount my rolling road here for SM3 on a plank of wood next to my rolling road for 00 with my Frog and my lock programmer all mounted on there. Have a single thing I can move onto my workbench when I want it and do all of this together. That's kind of how I approach it. That's pretty much it for what I want to talk about tonight. Here are some of the problems which I've heard about and things which I can't address right now or in the chat. But these are the kind of questions which I really appreciate your feedback for about, are these things that you would like us to walk through in the future? For example, how to install JMRI. It needs it needs Java 11 on your laptop. And upgrading Java seems to be difficult for some people. Is that something we should cover or not? Good to have your feedback. A lock programmer for ESU is only available for Windows. Would you like me to show you how I install that on a Mac using, well, I use Parallels, you can use Boot Camp as well, or do you not really care about that? How do you connect your laptop to your DCC command station with USB? And the problem is a lot of, I actually think a lot of the DCC hardware is way, way, way out of date, at least 10 or 15 years out of date. There's some more modern things coming from the European market, like from DigiK's and maybe even from ESU, which is a lot more up to date. So we need some old converter cables to connect things together. My NCE DCC system, which I don't use very much, does. You can buy a little add-on I've shown here in the window. It plugs into their cab bus and provides a USB socket at the other end. Great, it's $50, and it's a little circuit board, which it would be nice if it was in a little box. Maybe I'll put it in a box. Kind of a little bit ugly, but it's available. You can actually do that. Secondly, finally, should you be doing this using a programming track or programming on the main? What do those words even mean? Would that be a good thing for us to talk to in the future? Would appreciate your feedback on that. And I'll put finally on there, I really think it's a good idea. What I've discovered is to have a dedicated programming track or test track on your workbench using a Sprog linked to your laptop or something like that. I think that's been far the useful way for me to do that. I occasionally visit my friend Burr's layout, well, weekly, and it's a huge HO layout, a beautiful HO layout here in Seattle. Programming on the main there, I'm really scared. He's got probably hundreds of locomotives on his layout, and am I going to start programming the wrong one at the wrong time? So I don't know. So I'm a little scared of that. So I prefer to do all of this off the layout and on a programming track. I think it's much safer to actually do that. I promised when I take about 25 minutes today or 20 minutes today to go through this quick introduction as to how I've approached learning about DCC and done something useful. I'll be happy to answer your questions. You just email me and we'll figure out how to get hold of me. But I specifically want to let you know that we do have future clinics coming that will focus on demystifying decoder installation, configuring decoders with GMRI. Do you have any other ideas? Would you like to go through the problems I raised earlier and do that as like a panel discussion or something? So Jerry and I and the rest of the team who organize these teams, Pete and Russ and Joe, we'd love to get your input about what else we can actually do to help you. And if you think this is a good idea or not, I mean, are you all so knowledgeable about DCC you don't need any input? Great, I know I'm not. Or would you like to have some of these sessions? So on that, I am going to stop talking. That was just really to get us started on a series we want to do. If there are any questions, who was monitoring the chat, Jerry? I don't see many questions on the chat.
Yeah, we just had a couple of comments. Rod Jensen has asked us to discuss standardized 21 MTC wiring for interchangeable decoders so that you can unplug the decoder and plug in another decoder. Okay. We can certainly look at that. And David has asked us, has pointed out that the NCE USB interface is only for use with PowerCab. For the Power Pro system, you do need a cable, a serial cable to your computer, and that's in fact what I've got with my system. Yeah. Keith says, "This is great. I hope you do a few more. I especially would like to run a lock programmer on my Mac." Jim Brown says, "A lot of people abandoned Lens years ago due to the lack of radio throttles, but has now been resolved." I note that I believe it's Bill Scobie's layout we looked at. I believe he uses the Loc system. And the latest LZV200 command station has a built-in USB input, so you can just plug in your PC to the back of that. Good clinic, great clinic, Robin. So I would encourage, as Robin mentioned, we are talking about doing a series of programs or series of clinics related to DCC, and it's going to be driven by you. So you need to let us know what you would like us to cover. I mean, eventually we'd like to get down to the point where we're looking at some power on board even further on down the road. But I think first of all, we need to look at more of the nuts and bolts of DCC. So please let us know what you want to hear about, and do so in the chat right now if you want, or if not, you can post it right to the NNG site. We'll receive it that way.